Good morning. Hello, everybody, and you're welcome to this morning's Signpost webinar. And my name is Mark Gibson, and I'm the manager of the Teagasc Connected programme. As we come to the end of another week of lockdown, we hope that you're keeping safe and well wherever you are today. The Signpost webinar series is brought to you by Teagasc in collaboration with Dairy Sustainability Ireland, the National Rural Network, and Food Drink Ireland SkillNet. Today, we're going to be talking about how farmers can reduce their nitrogen usage by up to 50% with little or no impact on animal performance. While this may sound too good to be true, Teagasc research has shown that multi-species grassland swards can offer the potential to significantly reduce nutrient losses from agriculture. And I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. John Finn, who is a researcher in biodiversity and agroecology at Teagasc Johnstown Castle. Good morning, John. How are you today?
Good morning. Very well, Mark. Thank you.
Good, good. And we're also joined by Pat Murphy, who's head of the Teagasc Environment Knowledge Transfer Programme. Good morning to you, Pat.
Good morning.
So you're both coming to us from Wexford this morning. I hope the weather is fine down there today.
Glorious.
Glorious.
It's good. Always the sunny southeast here.
Oh, don't rub it in, John. Thanks. So, John, could you tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing in Johnstown Castle? I know you've quite a broad brief there, but particularly in the whole area of agroecology.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Yeah, I've been with Teagasc at Johnstown Castle for about 20 years now, and I was brought in as a researcher in biodiversity and agroecology. And really, I've been working at that interface between wildlife, biodiversity, and agriculture for the last 20 years, working on options for farmers to adopt in agro-environment schemes and demonstrating or investigating their effectiveness. Most recently, looking at results-based payments for biodiversity and ecosystem services, as well as work with life projects and nature conservation and high nature value farmland. I guess the other half of my research career then has been looking at multi-species mixtures and plant diversity in intensively managed systems and how they can help improve nutrient use efficiency and resource use efficiency in intensively managed systems.
So the work that you're doing, John, is really coming to the fore now, particularly in the context of these new ambitious targets set down by the European Green Deal and farm to fork strategies, up to 50% reduction in nutrient losses targeted, and I think 20% reduction in fertilizer usage, or nitrogen fertilizer in particular. So, I mean, this is particularly pertinent, isn't it, in over the next number of years? It looks like you're going to be a busy man with the work that you're doing.
Yeah. I'm reminded of that quote, an overnight success after 20 years of working at it. I've been working on this for about 20 years, and it seems that the time is coming when, as we approach a policy regime or an environment where nitrogen use and fertilizer use in general is expected to be reduced, then the use of these kinds of I call them technologies, which is what they are, multi-species mixtures, becomes even more compelling in that kind of a policy environment.
Very good. Well, look, I think that gives us a good tease up your presentation nicely, and you're going to be talking to us today about the science behind the multi-species grassland swards in Johnstown Castle and at other sites across Ireland. So if you could share your screen with us, John. And while you're doing that, just want to remind everybody, if you do have a question for John, please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, where you're welcome to put forward any questions or comments. We'd be delighted to discuss those at the end of the presentation. So John, we'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Mark. And again, thanks to Signpost Series for the opportunity to present our work, and and I'd like to acknowledge the many collaborators that we've had over the years who I've named here, but also many others in international projects, and good collaborators and good friends. What I'd like to focus on is multi-species mixtures, which have really been talked about a lot. And there's a very quiet revolution going on in parts of the countryside where many farmers are trying these out. And it seems like the gateway drug to multi-species mixtures is to just convert one paddock and see how they get on. And many farmers are starting to convert a lot more of their paddocks, given the experience with them. So before I go into the detailed science, the principle behind multi-species mixtures is that a group of species together will be able to utilize available resources better than a monoculture. This has been hotly contested for quite a long time. But the principle and the theory is that they can better utilize the available light, utilize the soil nutrients, utilize a deeper soil profile of nutrients and water, and of course then also have synergies amongst the species that result in, for example, nitrogen transfer from legumes to grasses, reductions in pests and reductions in diseases. And all of these different processes can act to improve performance of mixtures in theory. And the surprising thing is that there's been relatively little research, I'm not saying none, but relatively little research to dig through a lot of these theories and processes. And I suppose in the last 10 to 15 years, that's come to the fore much more. And that's what I'd like to focus on for the next 25 minutes or so. So what I'd like to talk about is, what are the effects of multi-species mixtures on yield and weeds as just two prominent examples, although as I mentioned a moment ago, mixtures are expected to affect an awful lot of other soil processes as well, but I'll focus on yield and weeds this morning. How do mixture yields respond to lower rates of nitrogen fertilizer, which is becoming really topical at the moment? And can mixtures mitigate drought effects? And also briefly hint at some of the next steps in research that we're aiming to undertake. So I want to start with my own start in research after my PhD, which was looking at multi-species mixtures, but in semi-natural grasslands. So we took plants like ranunculus, buttercup, grasses, dandelions, these kind of plants that you'd find in species-rich grasslands or in semi-natural grasslands, and manipulated the diversity of these and grew them in plots and tracked their yields over time. And what we saw was that as species richness increased, we saw this rapidly increasing response to richness that plateaued over time. Of course, the other way of interpreting this is that as species extinctions occur, you see this accelerating decline in ecosystem function, especially as you get closer to monocultures. And we asked, at the time, I remember asking the question, well, we see this very steep response in the initial phases of species richness, and could this apply to intensively managed grasslands? And I remember having, several fairly vigorous debates with people at the time who, it wasn't really clear. Could you always be able to find a monoculture that would be the best adapted to the existing conditions, or would multi-species mixtures of some sort or greater diversity be a better approach to avail of the available resources? And it was genuinely unclear what the answer would be. So I was delighted when we got the opportunity to test this idea in the Agro-Diversity Experiment, which was conducted as part of a cost action back in the early 2000s. And this was conducted across 31 agronomic sites across Europe in an international experiment where the same experiment was repeated at each site. We had 4 agronomic species and we sowed these in monocultures, equal proportions of the 4 species in a 4-species mixture, a dominant plant, one dominant of the 4 in a 70-10-10-10 mixture, and then 2 co-dominant species in a 4-species mixture as well. So overall, we had 11 different types of mixtures. We had the 4 monocultures, and we repeated this at 2 densities. So we had a design at 31 sites across 17 countries in Europe, including and Canada, and giving us 930 plots in total. And a key part of the design is that we didn't just assemble any random 4 species, that we were intentionally trying to maximize the functional traits or the variation amongst agronomic species. So we had grasses and legumes, but we had a fast establishing grass in lowland perennial ryegrass, which was most commonly used at the sites, and a fast establishing red clover, and a slower establishing cocksfoot. It wasn't always cocksfoot, but that was a prominent species in our set, and white clover. So we had this combination of fast and slow establishing, which was intentional to try and reduce weeds, and also a grass and legume contrast to try and maximize transfer of nitrogen from the legumes to the grass. So as I said, it was genuinely unclear what we would find. And I think a lot of the agronomists in our group expected that, the perennial ryegrass would consistently beat the mixture performance. So to have a look at the results of these experiments across Europe, here we have each of the 31 sites plotted on the x-axis, and we've got the yields in tons per hectare on the y-axis. And just to take one example here, we can see the 11 different types of mixtures which varied in their evenness, whether it was from the four equiproportional combinations of the four species, or dominance by one species, 70-10-10. So all 11 of those mixtures are represented by these circles. The performance of the best monoculture over the 3 years of the experiment is indicated by this short line, and then the performance of the average monoculture is indicated by this square. So what we can see across all of the 31 sites in general is a prominence of the mixtures performing better than the average monoculture, and this happened almost always. But also in a lot of the cases, and the majority of the cases, the mixtures are performing better than the best monoculture over the 3 years. And where this happened is indicated by these symbols at the top of the chart here. And the interesting thing is that we see this very big gradient in yield across all of the sites, going from approximately 20, 18, 19, 20 tons per hectare, right down to 3 or 4 tons per hectare at some of the less fertile and organic sites, although it wasn't because they're organic that they were less fertile. It was more the soil conditions in places like, if you go to Sardinia, for example, where it's a very short growing season and a lot of drought there. But regardless of the background level of fertility, we see an equal likelihood of the monocultures being able to beat the mixtures being able to beat the best monoculture. So it's just as likely to happen in the more fertile sites where there was a fertilizer application of up to about 180 kgs of nitrogen per year, down to some of these sites here which applied no nitrogen. So just to summarize that, we found that in 98% of these 930 plots, the mixture performance was better than the average monoculture performance. And in 65% of the plots, the mixture performance was better than the best monoculture performance. And on average, the mixtures were about 20% better than the best monoculture. So of course, we never measure our yields by total yield alone. It's also important to know what is the prevalence of weeds. And one of the features of multi-species mixtures, a lot of farmers query with us is how do we control weeds if we can't use a post-emergent spray? And this chart gives a really good insight where over the 3 years of the experiment, we can chart the weed invasion as the red bar here. So the percentage of the yield that comprises weeds is indicated by the red bar in the monocultures here in year 1 and in the mixtures here in year 1. So we can compare the monocultures versus the mixtures in year 1, year 2, and year 3. And what we see over the 3 years is this really strong increase in weeds from about 15% up to 34% of the whole biomass comprises weeds by the 3rd year. Whereas in the mixtures, the weed proportion is consistently staying at around 4%. So once you get good establishment, the mixtures, and this is well known, have an incredible ability to suppress weeds and keep them out. Okay, so moving on, one of the features of that experiment was that within each site, the same nitrogen level was applied to all plots. So it clearly says that applying the same amount of nutrients, you get better performance from mixtures. So another question is, well, what happens if we start lowering the rate of nitrogen fertilizer? And there's quite, relatively few examples of this around. So one excellent one came from one of our Swiss colleagues who implemented the same type of design where they're manipulating the proportions of legumes and mixtures, which is represented at this axis, where here you've got examples of 0% legume in the sward, which is grass only, and then 100% legume in the sward, which is legume only. And they're plotting yields. And just to talk you through it, here what's happening is we've got 3 levels of nitrogen fertilizer at 50, 150, and 450 kgs. And as the legume proportion increases, so it's 0 here, so this is the grass only sward at 50 kgs of nitrogen, and we increase the legume proportion to 10%, 20, we can see this really rapid response of the sward yield to the legume proportion. progressing along here to about 50% legumes. You see this really strong hump-shaped dome indicating these really strong synergisms between the grasses and legumes. And this is repeated to a slightly lesser extent at the 150 kgs and to a much lesser extent at the 450 kgs nitrogen. And we can compare this to the grass-only plots which were grown at 450 kgs of nitrogen. And this is really, really impressive at this site, where we see that by manipulating the legume proportion and applying only 50 kgs of nitrogen, we can beat a grass monoculture yield or a grass-only yield, which has had 450 kgs of nitrogen applied. So again, indicating how we can not just get, we can get more from less by manipulating the legume proportion in the sward. Another feature of this, of course, is that the higher nitrogen fertilizer reduced the legume percentages in the sward. So the nitrogen disappeared from the swards much, much faster at 450 kgs compared to the 50 kgs, which is, again, well known, but something to keep in mind as we try and manage clover persistence. Moving on to another topic, for a long, long time, we've been looking at research with mixtures under favorable conditions. And a really important question is, can mixture diversity protect against extreme weather events or against disturbances? And for the last number of years, we've been looking at various experiments testing, can mixtures help ensure us against drought? So this is an overhead drone shot of one of our experimental plots where you can see this lovely checkerboard effect. And you can see there's a number of high nitrogen high nitrogen perennial ryegrass monoculture plots in here, which you can clearly see sticking out with this really bright green. And this same plot later in the year, this was intended for drought experiments. You can see these drought shelters along the side here. I remember showing this to a group of visiting farmers and advisors. And I think they got quite a laugh out of the idea that we would be looking at drought effects on grassland in Ireland. But of course, later that year, this is what the same site looked at. And any of us trying to feed cattle during this weren't laughing at all, where we see, this is more akin to what you might see in Nairobi rather than Johnstown Castle at Wexford. And again, here we had to irrigate our so-called rain-fed plots to try and maintain this drought comparison during this experiment. So drought is an extreme weather event that is projected to become much more likely in the years ahead and will challenge not just Irish, but global agriculture. So we're looking at, how can drought affect grass growth? So grass growth through the season can be represented something like this, and drought, if it occurs at a time point like this, can affect grass growth very quickly, or it may be less slow and gradually decline like this in response to drought. And then once the drought ceases, and soil moisture levels recover, there are alternative ways in which the grassland can respond, which again, we don't know an awful lot about, or there could be a lasting legacy effect where there's a memory of drought kept in the system that means that subsequent performance is lower than expected. And to try and capture these different options, we're taking harvests, we're imposing experimental droughts and taking harvests at this point here, so we can tell the difference between a rapid effect of drought or a slow effect of drought in this resistance period. At the end of the drought, we can look at the consequences and how severe they've become. And then after the drought and the recovery period, we can look at how does the grassland plots recover. So we conducted this experiment as part of the EU animal change experiment, again using mixtures of different contrasting functional groups. Again, a deep rooting chicory, deep rooting red clover, shallow rooting grass, perennial ryegrass, and shallow rooting white clover. And the idea being that the deep rooting species would give additional benefits under the drought. We had plots with 1, 2, and 4 species communities, again manipulating the relative abundance of the species. We imposed a drought for 9 weeks using these experimental drought shelters that allow the air through, so they're not cooking the vegetation, they're allowing an airflow, and the air temperature only increases very, very slightly, but they are preventing rain and simulating a drought in this way. And again, applying 150 at the Irish site and 200 kgs of nitrogen at the Swiss site. So over the 6 harvests, and this is one example, the rain-fed control is represented by the black bars, and the drought is implemented at this point. And 4 weeks into the drought, we see only a very modest impact. But by the end of an 8-week drought period, we see this very severe drought impact with 70% reduction in yields. And once the drought ceases at this point, we see almost immediate recovery. Well, we do see immediate recovery in the next harvest, and even a little bit of a bounce back here in the following harvest. So this indicates that the grasslands are extremely resilient. Once the soil moisture was restored, the grassland growth bounced back very, very quickly indeed. What we want to do next is look at, well, what is the effect of species diversity and species richness on this resistance period, the severity of the drought in total, and the recovery period. And we're focusing on aggregating these three harvests and looking at what was the effect of species richness on these three harvests. So under the rain-fed control, which didn't have drought, of course, so under the rain-fed control, what we find is that as we increase species richness from 1 to 2 to 4 species, and yield is represented here, we see that the average yield increases significantly. So species richness gives us higher yields during, at the end of, and in the recovery period of drought. And in addition, we see this reduction in variability across the harvests. So we see increased performance, reduced variation, and of course, this is classic yield stability. So species richness promotes yield stability. We found this at the Wexford site and the Zurich site. And it was even more pronounced in the Swiss site here. And then the question is, do we see the same kind of response under drought? And the answer is yes. So here we see again an increase in yield with species richness and a reduction in the variation as species richness increases, which is classic yield stability, as I said. Again, you see this obvious effect of drought, which is to be expected, but the ability of richness to mitigate the effects of drought is very clear, and the same in the Swiss site. So looking at the Swiss site in more detail, the effect of the drought is represented by this distance here. So it's about 0.75 of a ton as we average across these 2 years and the 3 harvests. I mean, it's more severe in the specific, in the single yield at the end of the drought, but across the 3 harvests, it's averaged as 0.75 of a ton. And the negative effect due to drought is smaller than the positive effect due to species richness. So what this means is that the 4 species mixtures under drought had sufficiently greater yield that they actually yielded more than the average monocultures under rain-fed conditions, under the control. So this really proves that mixtures are a practical farm-scale mitigation action for drought. Having looked at 4 species mixtures under like this, I mean, the next clear question for us is to look at 6 species mixtures and increase that richness level even more and see, have we exhausted that capacity for plant diversity in intensively managed grasslands to mitigate the effects of drought? So in this new experiment, we're looking at this kind of a design, which is represented by 100% grass is represented here, 100% legume is represented here, and 100% herb is represented here. So we're manipulating grasses, legumes, and herbs with these monocultures. We also have 50% grass legume here, 50% grass herb here, and 50% legume herb here. So we're looking at how the different functional groups interact. And then 6 species combinations of these communities in this interior space, with this point here being a third grass, a third legume, and a third herb, composed of 2 grass species, 2 legume species, and 2 herb species. So, so we have a manipulation of the functional group diversity and looking at how does that respond to, how does yield respond to this change in diversity? And also, so here we have the grass, the legume, the herb monocultures, and in the very middle then the combination of all 3 functional groups. And we also repeat this under a drought treatment. So looking at the plots, that you can see this clear checkerboard effect here throughout the plots. And the results look something like this. So just to talk through this for a moment, taking this example here, it's the 2-year average of 7 harvests per year over 2 years. So it's the average of 14 harvests, looking at tons per hectare of dry matter forage. And this is a heat map showing that the deeper the green color here, the greater the yield. So this point here corresponds to just over 12 tons of dry matter production over here. And this is the rain-fed control. And again, you can see this variation where the herb production is the lowest, and you get greater and more or less equal performance of the grass, the average of the two grass monocultures, the average of the two legume monocultures. And then when we combine them, we see this clear response to mixing the species indicated by these concentric circles and this kind of peak in performance as you go towards the center. So looking at so again, that peak in performance is actually the very center of it is here, and it's almost 12 tons per hectare. Whereas we can see here that the performance of the grasses is about 10.5 to 11, say average at a 10.75 tons per hectare. So again, a very, very clear diversity effect, including a contribution from the herbs. In contrast, here we've got the same results for the drought treatment. So again, it's the grass, legume, and herb endpoints, and then mixing them all together in the center here. And again, these concentric rings in the heat map shows you get much greater yields in this point here where the 6 species are being mixed compared to the monocultures at the ends, which are all much more severely affected by the drought than the mixtures. And again, that midpoint of the drought where you have equal proportions of all 6 species is just over 10.5 tons. So just to summarize that, we see a very clear effect of mixture diversity on yields when there is no drought, but even more strongly when there is drought, showing it again as a strong mitigating practical farm scale mitigation action to combat drought. We also compared this to a high nitrogen response with 300 kgs of nitrogen. So these were, sorry, I should have said, these are all at 150 kgs of nitrogen per hectare per year. And we compared that to a lowly and perennial monoculture, which had 300 kgs of nitrogen per hectare. And that performance was more or less the same in both at just under 10.5 or around 10.5 tons per hectare. So we can see that the mixture performance here is considerably greater than the lowly and perennial monoculture with twice the fertilizer applied. And even the mixture performance under drought is marginally greater than the 300 kgs of nitrogen lowly and perennial under the control conditions. Again, showing the extent to which the mixtures can be an effective mitigation action. So we've also been looking at emissions, which I'll talk about in a minute. We've all showed that, again, weed invasion is lower due to diversity, and we've been looking at nitrogen content. We'll be reporting on that in a forthcoming work by Guillaume Grange, whose work this is. Just to summarize this work and pull out some of those really important points. So this is taking specific points from that work showing that the perennial ryegrass monoculture at 150 kgs of nitrogen is yielding here. So this is in 2018, the year of the drought. The perennial ryegrass monoculture with double the nitrogen is here. And here's the 6 species mixture with the 150 kgs of nitrogen. Similarly, under the drought side, the lowly and perennial at high nitrogen is relatively unaffected, but you can see a suppression of due to the drought of yields of this perennial ryegrass monoculture with 150 kgs of nitrogen. But still here you can see that the 6 species mixture with 150 kgs of nitrogen is still equivalent to the high nitrogen perennial ryegrass at either drought or the rain-fed conditions. Another piece of work on this looked at the greenhouse gas emissions and nitrous oxide emissions. So this work was done by Saoirse Cummins, and looking at what are the nitrous oxide emissions per ton of dry matter yield. Again, we see this clear reduction in nitrous oxide emissions intensity as we go from the perennial ryegrass with the high nitrogen to the perennial ryegrass with the lower nitrogen, and again, the 6 species mixture with the lower nitrogen being the lowest of all. So again, showing that the mixtures are not only improving yields, but they're also reducing the nitrous oxide emissions on an emissions intensity basis, but also on an absolute basis. Okay, so to conclude, I think this work shows that diversity in these swards matters, and the strategic selection of species, because we've been very strategic and intentional in what species we include, what functional traits we're manipulating. These are really important for the design of multi-species mixtures. These are not random gatherings of species. They're quite intentional for agronomic purposes. We've shown that the mixtures benefit yields, weed resistance, protein self-sufficiency, which I didn't show here, but is also shown, nitrogen efficiency and nitrogen use efficiency, yield stability under drought, and nitrous oxide emissions intensity. Also, legume percentage is really crucial to achieve a lot of these mixture benefits. I mean, it is the engine for a lot of the processes because of the incorporation of symbiotically fixed nitrogen to replace and displace fertilizer nitrogen or inorganic nitrogen. And really, I think this work shows that as we, as I said in the introduction, face into a policy environment where nitrogen is going to be more and more contentious and more controlled, the lower the nitrogen regime that you're facing, the more compelling seems to be the case for adopting multi-species mixtures. So just a signal or a look to the future, where we're going next with this work. We're looking at grazing trials, which we may talk about another day. And I know my good colleagues in UCD will be talking about this in one of the forthcoming Signpost series. We're really interested in soil fertility effects and what is the legacy effect, perhaps in a rotation of the grassland lay phase and its subsequent effects on things like soil health, soil fertility, soil microbiome diversity, and also soil carbon sequestration. And again, we're also interested in what is the role of multi-species mixtures as a forage input to anaerobic co-digestion with slurry for production of biomethane. So that's it from me. You know, if anybody wants to follow up on some of these things, I blog about this work quite a bit at this link here. If people want to follow up on some of the research links and the research papers. And with that, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, John. Thanks for that excellent presentation and some really useful graphics there to describe how the different herbs interact with each other. John, you talked a lot about the trials that are ongoing there in Johnstown Castle, the patchwork of plots that you have there. But how are these multi-species swards performing under grazing conditions with bovines and sheep as well? Or have we got evidence on that?
So I think we're really starting out on the research assessment, the research investigation of how do multi-species mixtures perform under livestock conditions, or maybe more importantly, how do livestock perform under multi-species conditions? And we've implemented this at Johnstown. UCD have got several, they're currently undergoing several investigations. They've completed a study on sheep, which is showing that multi-species mixtures have really positive effects on live weight gain, parasite control, and there was a really clear effect, positive effect of multi-species mixtures on livestock performance in the sheep system. We've been implementing it at Johnstown Castle over the last year. Last year was our first full year with a trial with dairy livestock in a dairy system, comparing a high nitrogen ryegrass and clover system with a lower nitrogen multi-species system. And it's very early to say, and you really want to conduct these systems trials for several years. But so far, they're neck and neck in terms of milk quantity and quality. So, we're quite impressed so far. Again, colleagues in abroad have clearly shown livestock benefits, where multi-species mixtures can perform even better than the grass clover. It's not just the monoculture perennial ryegrass at high nitrogen, but they can perform better than the grass clover at low nitrogen. So it seems to be an added kick from increasing the diversity beyond just grass clover, especially at lower nitrogen conditions. So there is definitely, what's clear from all of the research is that there is no significant drop off in nutritional quality and certainly the amount of forage that's available.
John, at the outset, I said that this may seem too good to be true. I mean, are there any downsides to multi-species grassland swards in an Irish context?
Yeah, I think the downsides are probably there is a question about persistence. We talk about this a lot, and can we get that clover and the herbs to persist? In some of the earlier work where people were putting in, many years ago, decades ago, where people were putting in multi-species mixtures which might have had 20 to 40 species, and it was clear after a year or two there was only 10 or 12 of them persisting, and after 3 or 4 years there was much fewer. So the idea that you pile on 30 or 40 species into a system like this is, again, it's not that strategic selection that we're aiming for here. On the other, so sorry, coming back to the point about persistence, but even with these lower diversity systems, which are 6 to 10 to 9 species, some of those species will disappear. But what we're keen to keep is the proportions, that you're not dropping below 20% for the herbs, and the clover is even more important. And there's technologies there that you can, or techniques that you can adapt, like there's over-sowing that can work. And I think we need work on this to say, if we do notice that there's a drop off in persistence, how can we rectify it without a full reseed? So there's options there. And James Humphreys and colleagues have been working this for years with spreading clover in the fertilizer spreader, for example, and reinstating it.
Yeah.
I suppose the other question is there a problem with persistence? I mean, there's a lot of concern about it, but some farmers seem to have no problem with them persisting, and others do. So I think there is an element of uncertainty there, but I think it can be managed, and we can also learn how to get better at managing it.
Yes. Okay, John. There's literally an avalanche of questions coming through here.
Absolutely.
So better get moving. But Pat, just before we go to the questions, can I just bring people's attention to the fact that next week is Water Quality Week, and that there are a number of important events happening during the week there. A lot of information available on the Teagasc channels, social media, and website. So do keep an eye out for those different topics that are going to be dealt with each week next week, starting the 22nd of March. And we're going to have Noel Meehan, who is the manager of the Teagasc ASAP program. He's going to be joining us on the webinar next week to finish out the week. So Pat, better get over to you quickly with get through some of these. We have 50 questions coming through already, so I can say now we're not going to have time to get through them all, but perhaps we can cluster some of them.
Yeah, okay. I suppose the first question there is, are there different establishment techniques required when sowing multi-species swards, or is it pretty standard for what you would be using for normal grassland?
It's pretty standard. I think it's pretty standard is the straight question, is the straight answer. I think if you have a field with a known weed problem, you've got to deal with that weed problem before you sow the multi-species, because you can't apply a post-emergent spray because it'll affect the herbs and the clover more likely. So you have to deal with any existing weed problem before you sow them. If you get good establishment, they are brilliant at keeping weeds out. And again, this is a point I often make. A lot of the so-called monocultures that we sow, once you go into a lot of those monocultures after 3 or 4 years, they ain't monocultures anymore. Whereas with the multi-species, you're controlling the species that are present in the sward.
A couple of specific questions on that in relation to docks, I suppose, in particular, and the management of docks, or do docks become a problem to the same extent as they would in a monoculture?
They certainly aren't a greater problem. I mean, if you've got an existing dock problem, they're not going to be a greater problem in the multi-species. You can't apply post-emergent spray. Like we have a field or two with dock problems in our place, and they're there. They're not spreading. It's not a problem. But I think if you've got a problem, you have to deal with it before you resow.
Okay. A question in relation to the output. You've talked about the output levels, but in terms of the feed quality, dry matter digestibility of the combined forage that's being produced.
Yeah. So we're looking at that, and in general, there's no significant difference. It can vary across studies. Sometimes it's slightly less, sometimes it's slightly more. Compared to perennial ryegrass. So, but in general, there's no. I think on average, there's no significant difference between the quality of what you produce from the multi-species mixes and perennial ryegrass. It's not deficient. Even some studies have shown that where the quality was slightly lower, the intake by animals is higher, and actually resulted in a net increase in animal performance because they found it tastier. They wanted to eat more of it. So I think it's very clear that there is no crash in a system if you introduce multi-species swards because of issues with quality. One of the related questions is its quality of silage, which of course is very important. And recent work by Thomas Maloney and Grange under the Smart Grass project showed that, again, it's very important to get because the water content is slightly higher in the herbs. You need to wilt it really well to get that quality silage. So it needs very good wilting, and then it'll make great silage.
In terms of persistence, when it's used, when it's cut for silage, is that a potential issue? So is it as versatile, I suppose, for moving between silage and grazing?
We think so. I think I'd say we're probably at version 1 or 2 in multi-species design here, in that I think the next step is start thinking about varieties and species that may be better tailored for grazed systems versus silage systems. But in general, we've been using them for livestock grazing, and then of course the excess forage is going into silage, and it's been working fine, and they're persisting for the moment. But we're only two years in.
Yeah, a question there in relation to, I suppose, a huge amount of work going into grassland management and sward heights and covers, etc. Do the same rules apply, or are we likely to have to change the rule set in terms of getting the management right?
Yeah, great question. And I think that's, again, our colleagues in UCD. And I just realized I forgot to mention my good colleague, Brendan Horan in Curtins, who's put in multi-species as well, which will be a great learning opportunity for these. I think what seems to be emerging from people who are working with graze systems for many years, farmers who have implemented them, is that a slightly longer rotation system, maybe aiming for 5 or 6 centimeters post-grazing height rather than 4, is a better approach. Using plate meter, because the species are that bit bulkier, you can get deceptively higher yields from the plate meter. And all of the farmers who use this talk about having to they do a mental rejigging of the plate meter reading for the multi-species. So there does need to be a recalibration of some sort. Again, like most systems, probably we will need to improve that measurement and tailor it for multi-species, because a lot of those systems have been built for perennial ryegrass monoculture. So that's not surprising.
John, could I ask a question in relation to, the amount of nitrogen that's been fixed by the rhizobia in the soil? Are there any concerns there that we are kind of bulking or driving the amount of nitrogen in the soil, and potentially can there be leakages as a result of that? I know there's a few questions on that coming through, but I suppose it's a general question that people would have about legumes in general. Yeah.
So I think if you've got an excess of legumes, and there has been work on this, you can have nitrate bleaching, that's for sure. Again, it's one of the design features of our mixtures, is that the idea is that the mixing of the grass and the legume and the herb, that the grasses are just brilliant at mopping up that spare nitrogen. So once the legume content is below 40%, for example, so usually it's about, like in our systems, we're aiming for about 33% in a 6-species mix, or when you've got grasses, legumes, and herbs, we're aiming for about a third of that to be legumes. And the idea is that the grasses and the herbs are there mopping up that spare nitrogen before it gets into the groundwater, or before it goes up as nitrous oxide. Okay. And if you get very high levels of clover, you will get greater risk of nitrate leaching, that's for sure. But these systems are, the way that their benefit is that they are using that nitrogen efficiently. So we're really trying to avoid that.
So there's a symbiosis there. I suppose you're cultivating. Question coming through here about the commercial availability of these mixes. Are they available, or can they be got?
Yeah. I know that I don't want to start naming seed companies, but most of your main seed companies in Ireland, they have them available for sure.
Very good. Pat?
Yeah, a couple of questions, I suppose, about suitability. In terms of wetter areas, how suitable, or how do they compare with your perennial ryegrass monoculture or grass clover even?
Yeah, fine. You'd expect them to be better, because you'd expect some of those other species to be better suited to conditions than just having a monoculture. That's the principle behind it.
And I suppose another question in terms of the baseline soil fertility, are you seeing any difference in performance? Does it need a higher level of soil fertility, or is it, I suppose, able to take a lower level, or is it pretty much the same as well? So in terms
I'm not quite sure I understand.
Sorry, in terms of I suppose P and K levels and pH, is it as tolerant as a general grassland sward, or does it need a higher level of soil fertility to thrive, or is it potentially able to work at lower levels?
It'll be I mean, you need to get all of those correct, as with any grassland production. You need to get your soil pH, your soil P, and your soil Ks right. And the soil P is important for the clover growth, but it doesn't require any major change from current approaches. You would expect, because I'll leave it at that. You need to get your soil conditions right for all grassland growth.
Okay, I suppose a good few questions in relation to output and milk output, etc. And I suppose two themes coming in there in particular. One is in relation to early season growth, where I suppose it's probably our most valuable grass. How productive is it at that point of the year? And I suppose the other question then is in terms of milk constituents and total milk output. While I suppose we may not have huge amount of research on it, but we have a number of places where it is being used, like in Johnstown, and there's some experiences at least coming from there.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not like there hasn't been any research done on it, and there's been plenty of farmers using multi-species. I mean, and multi-species are dominant in, let's say, Switzerland and many parts of the continent, where they may have slightly lower nitrogen levels than what we've got here in their general practice, but not a whole pile in places. And this is their mixture of choice. This is their grassland of choice, and they wouldn't be choosing them unless they were able to give them the milk quantity and quality that they want. We are able to, like I said, we've got multi-species over the last year, and it's very, very early to be making those comparisons for a system, but they're neck and neck in terms of milk quantity and milk quality with a lower nitrogen regime for the last year. I know Brendan Horn in Curtains is very pleased with their performance to date, and the UCD system is now two years underway, and I'm sure Helen and Tommy may be talking about that when they speak in a few weeks' time about their early experience with it. Again, there's other examples I mentioned, like Luke Delaby's work is showing that they had a 75 kg nitrogen input system, but again, the multi-species produced higher amounts of milk there, and perfectly adequate quality.
John, what about weed control? We've a question here coming from an advisor about saying that ragwort can be a major issue on multi-species swards. Have you experience of handling that, or how is that best managed?
I haven't had experience of it as a problem in multi-species swards in particular. I mean, where ragwort occurs, it's probably a problem there anyway, and it's just that you don't have that option for a post-emergent spray, I presume, is the issue. Usually, and there's actually been research on control of weeds by multi-species. They're better at suppressing weeds, but I guess it's not perfect. And there's nothing stopping the option of having a spot spray approach if there's a particular problem. We've done that. We had one field where there was a problem with thistles, and we just spot sprayed them, and that was the end of the problem.
A question in relation to ground cover and multi-species. Is it an issue in terms of open ground, or is it a problem? Does it lead to poaching or anything? No issue there.
No.
If
anything, the idea is that it utilizes that soil and canopy space even better. That's one of its benefits.
Okay. And is there any work in terms of the soil microbiome or soil biodiversity after a period in multi-species versus a monoculture?
We're starting that work, and it's too early to say.
Okay. Another issue in terms of if farmers decide to move into this, is there any issue with cows moving from a field with mixed species rich to multi-species to grass, maybe moving back and forward. I suppose the question is, can you move partially in without any issue in terms of digestion, etc.?
Yeah. Well, usually, in a well-designed multi-species mix where the clover content is, around that 30%, there should be no issue with bloat. You usually expect bloat when you'd have a much higher clover content, so that's not an issue. In terms of, I don't know if anybody remembers their first pint of Guinness. It's a bit of an acquired taste, and I think for the animals, one of our experiences in Johnstown was it is a bit of an acquired taste for the animals, but once they get used to it, they're kind of roaring to get into the paddock, so they have no problem with it. If you keep flicking them back from pure grass to the multi-species, I don't know which they start preferring. So it might be better to keep them consistently on one or the other, but there is no problem. I mean, they will eat it.
A question there: does the reduction in nitrous oxide, is that purely from the reduction in fertilizer use, or are there other impacts on greenhouse gases as well?
That is, so we're not counting the reduction. We're not counting the Haber-Bosch process in the background. It's purely what was measured in the field, if that's partly answering the question. And it is. It's not just from the nitrogen level, because you see a difference between the functional groups. So it's actually the type of mixture at the same nitrogen level. The type of mixture affects the nitrous oxide emissions, and more so the nitrous oxide emissions intensity, because you got such big changes. If you think about it, even if the nitrous oxide was the same across that gradient of mixtures that I was talking about at 150 kgs of nitrogen, but because you've got such a big difference in the yields, then the nitrous oxide emissions intensity is varying through the yield alone.
Okay, that's an interesting one, John, about the fact that you're not including the actual upstream nitrous oxide outputs.
Yeah.
So the savings are potentially much higher.
Oh yeah.
Because I was chairing the Legume Network conference there a few weeks ago, and they had Bob Rees from SRUC speaking, and he was saying that there can be a saving of 0.5 ton per hectare per year of CO2 from legume rotations, and so I mean that they're probably taking in those upstream type of benefits. But I mean that it would be interesting to see the figures on that. If you were to do that full life cycle analysis on the crop.
Well, we know that is an extremely energy intensive process, so that the effect of fertilizer will multiply by that upstream effect very quickly.
Is there any issue, positive or negative, in terms of animal health as a result of grazing multi-species?
Yeah, there is an issue. They seem to be healthier.
Okay.
Sorry, I don't want to be smart. That's
I asked the question.
Yeah, that's what Tommy Boland's work is showing, that the anthelmintic properties of in particular the chicory and the plantain, it seems, are resulting in fewer parasites in their lambs, increasing lamb live weight gain, so they're healthier.
Okay, and in terms of getting establishment, is it kind of a similar speed from sowing to grazing? There isn't a longer downtime?
No.
A question about
sorry, just to respond to that, I think you do your normal pull test. You'd just check that the animals won't pull the plants out of the ground, and it's the normal approach.
A question about perceptions. Do you think now people get used to looking across a farmer's land and seeing this nice even, no weeds, and that's how they judge it, and that's how the farmer considers himself being judged?
Yeah.
This looks different. This looks a little bit messier, if you want to use that word.
Yeah.
Is that going to be an issue with people? Before COVID hit, I would say we were inundated with requests from farmer groups, co-ops, and others to visit these and have a look at them. And every whole group that visits says, "Wow, there is a huge cultural shift required to look at this
field of what looks like weeds. And, you know, I think we've got much bigger cultural shifts coming towards us in terms of climate change challenges, drought, nitrogen regimes, how to make our agriculture more sustainable. And I think this will be, getting used to the look of multi-species mixtures will be a minor shift compared to some of those. That's how I look at it. And when we talk to farmers about it and explain it, they see what's going on and understand it. So I think there's a strong advisory element as well here.
So, John, just on that, I mean, what do you think needs to happen to support that advisory effort and that cultural shift that's needed?
I suppose, look, a lot of the impetus for this will be dictated by policy decisions in the forthcoming future. And we know that with Acclimatize, for example, there's a very clear fix on nitrous oxide emissions and the role of fertilizer application in those. There is, I mean, I think we'd be a bit more comfortable, even though we know in practice there's a lot of success stories about the implementation of multi-species swords. I'm sure there's a few negative stories out there as well, but it would be reassuring to assemble and have that research that's ongoing in multiple sites at the moment concluded. I'm pretty sure the answer will be positive, and we're seeing that the start of that. But it would be nice to have a lot more of these grazing trials implemented and underway to give reassurance and, I suppose, practical demonstration that these work. And I'm sure there's many farmers around the country could say they could already provide practical demonstration. And we probably at that point do need to start considering the extent to which our advisory service is delivering that message or not.
John, you might just talk about a few of the trials that, particularly, I suppose, grazing trials that are going on around the country, and examples. Just
so, you know, again, those farmer groups that we have coming in, you know, there's never been a group that one or two of the farmers aren't already trying it. You know, again, you know, that gateway drug is just when you're reseeding, throw the seed into one of the paddocks, and there's an awful lot of people experimenting with it, which is great. That experimentation might be better if it's accompanied by better advice, you know, because I'm sure some of the disaster stories that might be out there are probably caused by not doing it the right way. Come back to your question. Yeah, there's examples like there's some of the EIPs are doing this. There's one led by Ag Research in Northern Ireland looking at multi-species mixtures. The folk in the Inishowen Peninsula EIP are looking at multi-species mixtures. There is the Bride project in Fermoy is implementing multi-species mixtures. They're not experiments per se, but they are practical implementation and demonstration. In terms of the experiments, UCD Lions has grazing experiments going on. They've had the work with the lamb livestock work completed. We've got work in Teagasc in Johnstown Castle. There's work starting up in Grange. There is work ongoing at Curtins and Moore Park with Brendan. So, you know, and I'm sure there's a few that I'm missing. You've had the grass clover work going on at Clonakilty for several years. Again, highlighting the importance of clover. Phil Creighton's work with sheep in Athenry, if I remember correctly. Also looking at grass clover combination. So, you know, we are building up a bank of knowledge about the importance of legume-based grassland, which is the important element here.
Okay, John, we're going to have to wrap it up there. We're hard to believe it. It's 10:30 now. Thank you so much for answering so many of those questions. You were, it was like a boxing round there with all the questions coming.
It's like mastermind.
Well, we could stay another hour.
Or not, but anyway.
They keep going with the amount of questions we've got in, and I suppose we will be returning to the topic in a few weeks' time. So it's if you could save your questions for them. But yeah, I think it's a watch this space, I think, and I suppose the message that I'm getting from you is, listen, if you feel like dabbling, don't be afraid to do it. Go for it and see how it works, and it'll all add to the pool of knowledge and all help.
Absolutely. So just before we let you go, we just want to remind you that the Teagasc Signpost series podcast is now available. It's available on Spotify, Google Play, and Apple Podcasts. So if you want to catch up on John's presentation today, or indeed any of the presentations since the start of the series, they're now available, all available on the those various podcast platforms. So look, I just want to say thank you again, John. Really enjoyed your presentation. Pat, thank you for helping with the questions today. Huge amount of questions. And I think that volume of questions really endorses the work that you're doing, John, and the hunger that's out there for, you know, these types of solutions. So well done on that. Finally, I just want to thank our production team, in particular Andy Boland, Catherine Keena, Pat Murphy, and Yvonne Maher. And so from all the team, take care, stay safe, and enjoy the weekend. Thank you. Bye-bye.